Hello, Dave. Frank here.
Yeah.
Okay, so that was the test. I see everybody put their hand up because you couldn't hear me. Thank you. I'm going to put it down. Alrighty, let's move along with the program. I think based on your check ride there, everybody's checked out. Well, obviously this is a PowerPoint presentation, but no sleeping allowed because you are going to get a Wings program credit for a basic knowledge credit. The sponsors of the webinar are the FAA safety team. I'm a volunteer safety rep on the FAST team, and the Center for Airmanship Excellence. What I want to do is take just a minute here and open up the mics on a few of you so that we can all get a better feel for who's here this evening. And if we get 2 or 3 folks to comment on these questions, I think we'll all get a good feeling for who's on the webinar tonight. So I'm going to go back to Frank Bacon because I know you're there, Frank. Can you hear me, Frank?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Could you answer 1 or 2 of these questions for us, Frank, or as many as you want, just to kind of let the folks know what your flying background is?
Well, I do mostly instrument flying, but right now I'm flying just a Piper Archer, and I'm not flying very much, mostly because of the weather up here. And I got to the webinar from the FAA FAST website. So did you get that?
And Frank, you're a fairly frequent attendee at these webinars, so welcome back. I see. Let me scroll through the list here and see who else. Oh, there's one. Joseph. I'm really going to murder this, Joseph. I apologize. Imunkowski, do I have that right? Your mic is open. Joseph, are you there?
Yes.
Can you answer a couple of these questions for us? Okay, I think Joseph is having a little bit of a problem. We've run into this on all of these webinars that sometimes the mic hookup out there in the field isn't right, or there's gremlins in the system or something, and we can't get inbound audio when I open up folks' mics sometimes. But generally it works. So I see that Mark Rakowski has his hand up. Mark, I've opened up your mic. Would you care to share what it is with us?
Sure. Right now I'm working on my instrument rating. I fly a Cessna 172RG. I'm not flying as much as I'd like because being in Wisconsin we're having some weather issues. And I'm just interested to soak up as much information about pilotage as I possibly can.
Great. Thanks, Mark. And let me scroll down here and see who else might have their hand up. Here we go. Ray Damangenitis. I murdered that one probably a little bit, Ray, but can you hear me? Are you there, Ray? Your mic is open. Okay, I'm just getting dead air, so I think we have a problem with Mike's hookup. Let me just go down a little bit further. Here we go. Stephen Serby. Stephen, your mic's open.
Hey, how are you tonight?
Great. You?
Fine, thank you. What kind of flying I do? I typically do a lot of single-engine stuff, but acquired multi-engine rating a couple of years ago. And I do some ride-along stuff in a C510 Mustang. Probably do around, I'd say around 50 hours a year, but certainly like to get a lot more than that. And I've signed up for the fast notifications from the FAA, so I see them in my box all the time. So yeah.
Great. How do you like?
Go ahead.
How do you like that Mustang?
That is such a sweet ride. I tell you what.
Uh-huh.
That G1000 package on it is just with the SBT on it. It's really nice. It really is nice.
Yeah, I bet it is. I'm got that on my wish list. I'm getting real itchy to get my hands on it. So thanks, Stephen. Go ahead.
An old road myself back from the Fort Rucker days. I was down there about 89 to probably 91.
Yeah, a little after me. I was down there in the early 70s.
Oh, yeah. Probably flew something you flew, though, right?
Probably. Great. Well, welcome, Stephen. Thanks. Okay, I'm going to take another quick scroll through, see if anybody else has a burning desire to share some of this with us. Yes, Dwayne Cottingham. I've opened up your mic, Dwayne.
Hi, how are you tonight?
Great. You?
Fantastic. Glad to be along. I'm a 41-year pilot flying a Citabria 7K cab off my farm. Love it. Do a little aerobatics in the process and try to get about 60, 65 hours a year, and glad to join you tonight.
Great. Well, that's pretty good flying time. So welcome, Dwayne, and thank you for sharing that with us. Well, I'm going to put everybody's hands down, so we'll start with a clean slate there. And if you guys think I've gone to sleep here periodically, it's because, again, this control panel on my end is not very user-friendly, so I have to pay attention, or I hit the wrong buttons or don't hit the right button. All right, let's move into the actual webinar here this evening. We talk about this case study in the context of Airmanship 2.0. That's what this is all about. And I realize that if you don't know what Airmanship 2.0 is, it's a little difficult for you to get the most out of this as possible. I've tried different ways of presenting Airmanship 2.0 before and after the case study. And I'm come back to doing it before the case study itself, but abbreviating it considerably. So if you folks have seen the briefing before on Airmanship 2.0, now's a good time for about a 5-minute break. It'll take about 5 minutes to run through this abbreviated version. And I've got to start out by saying that Airmanship 2.0, I put the asterisk there because it's as defined by the Center for Airmanship Excellence. You won't find Airmanship 2.0 defined in the AIM or the FAA Handbook of Airplane Flying or anything like that. We made that up to distinguish what we're talking about from the way that we have been flying in the personal flying segment of the general aviation industry. So again, this is just a flight level 510 reconnaissance flyby. I'm not going to go into much detail here at all. I just want to give you a flavor for what Airmanship 2.0 is. In Airmanship 2.0, we use the Kern Airmanship model. Dr./Colonel Tony Kern is probably the recognized expert on airmanship. We think he is. He's written 5 books on airmanship. We've all read them, or some of us have not read them all, but we've read his books. And we can't find anything in any of his writings that we disagree with. Imagine that, a bunch of experienced pilots agreeing on something. So Kern's really good. We think he's got airmanship nailed. So we used Kern's book, Redefining Airmanship, Discipline, and some others of his books to create what we call Airmanship 2.0 But as you'll see, as you learn more about it, it's all things that have been around for a long time. Really, the current airmanship model is the scaffold that we use to build our airmanship knowledge and our airmanship skills. So let's take a little bit of a look here at the model in just a little bit. Oops, I hit the wrong button. Stand by. In just a little bit more detail. There are 3 bedrock principles in the model: discipline, skill, and proficiency. Then upon those 3 bedrock principles rest the 5 pillars of knowledge: knowledge of self, aircraft, knowledge of team, knowledge of environment, and knowledge of risk. And upon the 5 pillars of knowledge rest the 2 capstone outcomes: situational awareness and judgment. So as you'll see, as you learn more about Airmanship 2.0, you can use this scaffold to structure training, to structure your personal airmanship development, to evaluate your airmanship level. All kinds of good things come out of this model. Another way to look at Airmanship 2.0, what is it, is to ask the question, if I don't fly right, should I fly at all? I mean, at the surface, this seems like a very simple question, but if you really think about it, right, what does right mean? But if I don't fly right, if I'm not going to do everything as right as I can, should I even fly at all? And that question is answered in Airmanship 2.0 by Chuck Yeager when he said, if you're going to fly, do it right. Now, we lifted that quotation out of Redefining Airmanship, but Kern goes on to explain that when Yeager was first started to be quoted for this this statement, he was a young test pilot. So this isn't the old general 60-some-year-old Chuck Yeager who got conservative and paranoid, like all of us old aviators have a tendency to do. He's been saying this all along, and he's generally recognized to be one of the top aviators on the planet. So that's Chuck's motto. If you're going to fly, do it right. It's my motto, and it's the motto of Airmanship 2.0. So another way to look at Airmanship 2.0 is doing it right. Of course, the devil's in the details of what doing it right means. Airmanship 2.0 is really a new paradigm in personal flying. It's a new way to approach it. But it's based on tried and true airmanship principles that have proven to be effective with the airlines and military. But we've modified those for use by us, by personal flyers, in today's flight environment at a reasonable cost. So a lot of people will say, well, you can't have all of these things that the airline guys have and the military guys have that enhance their airmanship, make it safer, make it easier, make it more fun and enjoyable. And the answer is yes, you can, because we've run the cost analyses, and a lot of us have looked at it, and we think that we can do all these things we're talking about at a reasonable cost in Airmanship 2.0. Airmanship 2.0 is a new way for you to enjoy flying. So if you've been flying for a long time, I know from personal experience and guys I talk to, the bloom is kind of off the rose for a lot of us. So it's a new way for us to get back in there and enjoy it. For those of you who have not been in flying very long, it's a way for you to keep enjoying it. We have that old saw about the $200 hamburgers and boring holes in the sky. So Airmanship 2.0 is a way to enjoy it more. It's also a new approach to maximizing the personal rewards you get from flying. And of course, Airmanship 2.0 increases the value you get for your flying dollar. We all believe that flying is too expensive. It should be free, right? It should be somebody else should be paying for this for all of us. But we in personal flying, we have to pay for it. So we need to get the maxed value out of every dollar we spend, and Airmanship 2.0 is designed to do that for you. Airmanship 2.0 continuously enhances your airmanship skills, knowledge, and capabilities. And that's what Airmanship 2.0 is all about. Airmanship 2.0 is a surefire way for you to become a safer, more proficient aviator. Standby 1, I'm scanning the roster for hands up. I see a hand up, but I think that was Joseph Imilkowski. Joseph, did you have something you wanted to comment on?
Is my mic working now?
Mic's working great now. I hear you 5x5.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I wasn't expecting to participate audio-wise, so I didn't even have the mic hooked up.
Okay.
That's it. So go ahead. Go ahead.
Great. Thank you for doing that and letting us know. I'm going to mute your mic again. Put your hand down. Okay, and that's what I'll do periodically is I'll go through and see if I see hands coming up, and I will try to get to you for your question or comment. All right, looks like the board is clear. Stand by while I get us back to where I need to be, and we'll proceed. Airmanship 2.0 includes a flight operations support team. This is actually a very important element of Airmanship 2.0. And that flight operations support team does trip planning, helps you with trip planning, flight planning. It dispatches flights with you. It tracks your flights. It provides in-flight support, and it provides trip management. It really is shared decision making and checks and balances. Those are airmanship terms. And that's what the flight ops support team provides. Well, again, it was only the 51,000-foot flyby. That was just the tip of the iceberg. Very little information there about what Airmanship 2.0 is, but I hope it gives you a little bit of context here. If you want to explore it more, go to the Center for Airmanship Excellence website, airmanshipexcellence.org, and there's a subweb there, a menu button. Go to Airmanship 2.0, and there is a series of video briefings in that subweb that will tell you everything you want to know about Airmanship 2.0. All right, at this point, are there any questions or comments about Airmanship 2.0 before we move into the case study? And I'm going through the roster again, so please raise your hand if you have any questions or comments. Joseph, I see your hand up again. I'll bet you I've had this before. There's something going on with your button there for that, so I'll ignore that if you don't mind and check with you later. But I imagine it's just popping up on its own. Okay, I don't see any questions or comments at this time. Stand by one more second. Quite an extensive list here this evening, so it takes me a little while to get through it. Okay, I'm going to go back to what I have to do here, and we'll move on. All right, this Airmanship 2.0 case study number 7, one wing low. Now, we're not going through this case study to point fingers at anybody. Quite the contrary. You know, James Joyce said that mistakes are the portals of discovery, and that's what we're here for this evening, to learn from others' mistakes. And that's a tradition in Airmanship 1.0 as well as it's a tradition in Airmanship 2.0, is to try to learn as much as we can without having to make our own mistakes, because our mistakes can be fatal. What we're really trying to do is practice, learn how, get a feel for identifying error chains that lead to accidents. And we identify the error chains link by link. So we're trying to learn how, sharpen our skills at identifying links in error chains and then removing those links. The data shows that, well, I shouldn't say the data shows. I have heard, read, seen a few places now that most accidents result from a error chain with 5 to 7 links in it. Now, I can't tell you that that's exactly the right number. I've analyzed a lot of accident reports, and I can see the links in the error chain, but I haven't gone to the trouble of adding them up yet. Maybe I should start doing that. But there's a series of links that hook together in a chain of events, if you will, that lead to every accident. And generally speaking, if you can remove even one of those links, the accident won't happen. So that's what we need to get better at here, all of us, even if we're practicing Airmanship 2.0 or not. So this webinar then will examine an airmanship-related accident. So it was an accident that was caused by airmanship problems that could have been prevented if the pilot had been practicing Airmanship 2.0. And this case study involves the fatal crash of a Pilatus PC-12. I've taken all of the information that you'll see here in the presentation this evening from the NTSB accident report, and they titled it "Loss of Control While Maneuvering." And it happened on March 22nd, 2009, so just about 3 years ago now, and a Pilatus PC-12/45. That's the airplane right there, the right end number, 128 Charlie Mike. It was owned by Eagle Cap Leasing, and that was actually a combination of about 4 owners, and they hired contract pilots to fly the airplane. This accident was on a Part 91 IFR operation. There were 14 occupants in the airplane when it crashed, 1 pilot and 13 passengers. About 14:32 Mountain Daylight Time on a flight from Oroville, California to Bozeman, Montana, 128 Charlie Mike diverted to Burt Mooney Airport in Butte, Montana. So I wanted to show you the sat picture just to give you a little idea. Here's the airport right there where that green dot is. And that's sitting down in that valley and pretty high peaks all around it, but it's kind of an irregular, a very irregular valley. The runway runs northeast, south, or northwest, southeast here. So you can see you're not going to go straight in. You're going to have to come in here and fly around these ridges to get in. And he was coming in to land on the north. So a real challenging airport to get into, even on a good day. When the crash occurred, about 2,100 feet west of runway 33 at Butte. So he was very close to the runway. He made it within half mile of the runway roughly before he crashed. So he almost made it. And here you can see at some of the times, 14:30:01 he was at 93, 14:30:25 he was at 91, but the field elevation is 5550, so he was way high getting close in, and that's part of the problem here you'll see. And there's the initial impact point. The pilot and the 13 airplane passengers were fatally injured, and the airplane was substantially damaged by impact forces and post-crash fire. Visual meteorological conditions prevailed at the time of the accident, so it wasn't a IFR-related accident, if you will. The pilot held an airline transport pilot certificate with a rating for multi-engine and commercial privileges in airplane single-engine land. So he had proper credentials for flying the flight. The pilot's most recent second-class medical was dated April 4, 2008, so he's coming up on a renewal on his second class, with the limitation that the holder must possess corrective glasses for near vision, so no biggies there. The pilot had flown for the U.S. Air Force between 1969 and 72. He was type rated on the Lockheed L300, which is the C-130, and the T-33, which some of you guys remember that was a single-engine jet trainer the Air Force used for logistics and training and a lot of things. The pilot had also flown the DC-8 for trans-international airlines for about a year. He had flown for Southern Airways for about a year. They were flying DC-9s back then. He flew for Resort Commuter Airlines from 88 to 89. So, in addition, he flew the PC-12 for Native American Air Ambulance from 1999 to 2002. When he was not employed as a professional pilot, he worked in various fields not related to aviation, so he was a semi-professional, I would call him. The pilot was hired by Eagle Cap Leasing in November 2002 as a contract pilot, so 7 years before the accident. Been there a long time. He had accumulated 8,840 hours total flight time, quite a bit, with 1,760 in the PC-12, which is a lot in type. He had flown 35, 26, and 10 hours in the 90, 60, and 30 days preceding the accident. So he flew 10 hours in the month preceding. He flew a little more than 10 hours a month in the 3 months preceding, or almost 10 hours, 3 months preceding that. So he was doing right around 10 hours a month. The Air Force did a study, and for multi-crew MATS type, cargo type flying, transport type flying, the Air Force came up with the optimum number of hours a month to have peak proficiency is 40 hours a month. 30 hours a month. More than that, you have a tendency to go for complacency and fatigue and so forth, and less than 30, you're not flying enough to maintain your proficiency. And I know most of us in personal flying are flying a lot less than 30 hours a month, so we need to think about that. But based on that Air Force study and my own personal experience, I would say 10 hours a month in this kind of an airplane is minimum for maintaining proficiency, if that. The pilot was 65 years old, so he had a lot of experience. The pilot flew the accident plane from OBE to Bozeman on March 7th, 2008, which was about a year earlier. That's Oroville. About a year earlier. So he knew the route, although he obviously didn't fly it a lot, so he wasn't an expert on it, but he wasn't new to the route. FAA records indicated no previous accidents, incidents, or enforcement action, so that's good. The pilot's most recent recurrent PC-12 training was completed on January 9th, 2009, so he was fresh out of recurrent. The instructor stated that he had conducted several previous training sessions with the pilot between 2003 and 2009. In one of my aviation lives, I was an instructor and check airman for flight safety on Challengers, and for about 4 years. And so I had, out in Tucson, and so I had guys coming back where I'd work with them every year on their recurrence. And I really got to the point where, you know, I knew really accurately the level of airmanship a particular pilot would possess after the second, third time, for sure. So this instructor, who we're going to get some information from in a minute, had worked with this guy plenty to know a lot about him. The instructor reported that during the latest session, he and the pilot had discussed slow flight, stall, and icing procedures, and that's an important part of this, and reviewed emergency procedures for the airplane. So that would be standard for this type of recurrent training. They also would have reviewed limitations and that sort of thing, operating recommendations and all that, cautions, warnings. The instructor also reported that the pilot showed a very high level of competency in the airplane and superb professional judgment. So I think you can see from this guy's training, a military airline, 135, so on, that he had developed a very good professional judgment. Further, the instructor stated that during a post-flight briefing, the pilot indicated he had not experienced any undue pressure to fly in bad weather or with mechanical problems. And I used to ask all the crews that I trained on the Challenger about that, because, you know, we call it pilot pushing, but if you work for somebody that owns the airplane and they put a lot of pressure on you to fly when sometimes you don't think you should fly, that is a highly risky situation, and there are strategies you can employ to mitigate that risk. So I would pass those along and share them with the guys if they didn't know about them, if they were in that kind of situation. But obviously this instructor was very experienced. He had asked this guy about that kind of external pressure, because that's important for decision making, risk management, and the pilot at least reported that the company he was working for didn't put any pressure on him. And an owner of the aircraft praised the pilot's professionalism. Now, it doesn't say in the report whether that owner is a pilot himself, but after 7 years, you know, at least it shows the pilot didn't scare him. So, but the pilot thought he was a real professional pilot, or the owner thought he was a real professional pilot. On March 18th, which is 3.5 days before the accident, the pilot flew passengers aboard the accident airplane on a flight that departed REI. I'm sorry, I'm not coming up with the airport name. We're going to see it in a minute. I think it's Redmond. About 11:30 Pacific Daylight Time, and arrived in Cabo San Lucas, Mexico, 3 hours later. So a pretty long leg in that Pilatus, but he flew just one leg that day. Then they stayed at a local hotel. They had a layover until the morning of March 21st, which was the morning before the accident flight day. But his activities during that layover were unknown, so who knows if he was out partying or if he caught up on his sleep or what he was doing. We just don't know that. The pilot and passengers departed Cabo San Lucas on March 21st about 10:30 in the morning, so it wasn't an early launch, and arrived home about 15:30 after stopping in San Diego to clear U.S. Customs. After arriving at REI, the pilot prepared the airplane for a trip to Bozeman, acknowledged a change in the trip, which could be significant because it was last-minute kind of change, and he filed 3 flight plans. So this is the day before. No further information was available regarding the pilot's activities until the next morning when he flew the accident flight, or he started out on the day of the accident flight. So we don't know if he got a good night's sleep the night before. His wife refused to testify to the NTSB, so maybe there was something there, maybe there wasn't. The NTSB found no evidence indicating that the pilot had completed a weight and balance computations for any of the flights on the day of the accident. And you can see here that on the first leg of the accident day, takeoff weight was just slightly under, well, it was adequately under max gross, but not terribly under. On the second leg, he was over max gross. On the third leg, he was over max gross. So he was ignoring the max gross weight limitation on the airplane. But the center of gravity was within limits. On the day before the accident, the contract pilot had the airplane topped off with 220 gallons of Jet A to its total capacity at Redlands. That's RAI, I'm sorry, Redlands, California Airport, which is just out here to the, to the east of the Los Angeles basin. It's out here, Redlands. Okay, stand by one while I check for hands up. Just give me a second. So please don't put your hands up. I'm sorry, that almost sounded like a command of hands up. I apologize. Okay, Frank Blair, I see your hands up. I've opened up your mic. Go ahead, Frank.
Hi, it's Frank. I was just saying it's Redlands, California, so but you got to it. No problem.
Thanks, Frank, for contributing that. You know, that's one reason I do these PowerPoints. You know, I knew it was Redlands, but I couldn't remember it. So, and I didn't review the PowerPoint enough to make sure I had that up front. So thank you, though, for that. Okay, I don't see other hands up, and I'm putting all the hands down. Stand by just 1 second. Okay. The pilot did not request that a fuel system icing inhibitor be added to the fuel load that he took on there at Redlands. The fuel truck at Redlands contained fuel that was not pre-mixed with, and I'll use the term PRIS, that's the trade name for it. Most of us know it as PRIS. There are other brands, though. But the fuel pump was capable of injecting PRIS during the fueling at the request of the customer. What it is the can comes with the nozzle has a little clear plastic tube, and then there's a bracket on the fueler nozzle that you plug the tube into, and you connect the can to the nozzle in a bracket, and when you squeeze the fuel handle to put the fuel in, it also then opens up the valve on the can, and it shoots a metered amount of PRIS in with the fuel as it's put in the tank. Very simple system. Fuel records showed that between February 27th and March 21, the airplane had been fueled at Redland 4 times without the addition of PRIS. So that's significant. Most PC-12 flights require the use of PRIS. So this would have been covered in his initial training, in his recurrent training, when they went over limitations on the airplane. There's no way he could not have known that he should be using PRIS on most of his flights. And it's an outside temperature limitation, which then translates pretty much into a time of year altitude limitation. All right, I've got the first poll question here for you. We've got a few poll questions tonight. Here's where I have to really pay attention and step through this. So stand by while I get the polls up. First poll question. Okay, there is the first poll question up. And the question is, stand by. So I just lost the question for some reason. So you guys can read the question, if you would please, and go ahead and pick any of those that apply. Okay, I see a few more are still voting. I should be able to see that question here on my control panel, but for some reason I got locked out of the list that shows it to me, so can't read that word for word for you, but you guys can read it. Okay, I think just about everybody has put in their vote, answered. Okay, I'm going to close the poll and share the results with you. So we can see here that 14% think that the accident pilot's load time in flight in type was a link in the error chain. 20% think that the accident pilot's lack of pilot time was a link in the error chain. 14% think the accident pilot's lack of recent training was a link in the error chain. 31% think fatigue, and 90% think his failure to follow procedures was a link. I would agree with all of that. Those first 4 maybe there might have been something in that, but he had a lot of time in type. He had a relatively high amount of total time, so I would agree with you there. Those probably small factors. He just had recent training, so fatigue, maybe there's some clues there that he might have been in fatigue. But the big one there, I see with you, I agree with you, with 90% of you, that first link in the error chain was he wasn't following established procedures. And when you learn cockpit resource management, risk analysis, risk mitigation, all that sort of thing, you look for what I call caution and warning lights. And the failure to follow established procedures is one of the first big caution and warning lights that shows up in a lot of error change. So, all right, I'm going to hide that and move back to where we're going here. All right, at 1946 Pacific Daylight Time, the day before the accident, as we mentioned earlier, the pilot filed 3 flight plans for the next day with flight service. So he was on top of it. He got his flight plans filed the day before. The first flight plan indicated that only the pilot would be on board for the flight. From Redlands to Nut Tree, up in Vacaville, which is up, as you can see there, northeast of the Bay Area. According to the EIS, the Electronic Instrument System trend data, which they pulled in from the memory on it after the crash, for the flight, the average outside air temperature was a -32. That happens to be much colder than the Pilatus book says it needs to be before you have to have PRIS. So in other words, he was way below the temperature for the PRIS requirement on that first leg, and it was a long leg, about an hour and 40 minutes up there. About 1 hour and 30 minutes into the flight, so about the time he was going to start down, while the airplane, I'm sorry, he was already starting down, while the airplane was descending through an altitude of about 10,000 feet, the left and right boost pumps began cycling, generally on and off for 10 seconds, and then on for 10 and then off for 1. And we're going to talk about how those boost pumps are supposed to work in a second. So that's a clue there. According to the Pilatus AFM, the fuel boost pumps operate automatically if a low fuel pressure state exists. The fuel pumps continue cycling for 15 minutes, even though they were designed, or in this flight, they continued cycling for 15 minutes, even though they were designed to turn off automatically 10 seconds after the fuel system pressure was restored to 3.5 psi. After both fuel boost pumps had cycled for 15 minutes, the left fuel boost pump was on continuously and the right fuel boost pump was off. And they were both set in the auto mode at this point. A left-wing heavy fuel imbalance of about 70 pounds was created. That would have been about 2 segments on the fuel indicator. So noticeable, but not, something to jump right out at you maybe. I'd have another poll question for you. Stand by. Okay, I'm going to read this first. Are any of the following links in the error chain? Are any of the following links in the error chain? Okay, it looks like everybody's voted. I'm going to close the polls and share the results with you. And we can see that 35% think the lack of pilot's aircraft knowledge was a link, 61% think an unexplained anomaly was a link, and 67% the pilot's lack of discipline. I'd agree with all of that, although I would weight that first one, lack of aircraft knowledge, much higher because we had an anomaly going on. That wasn't the way those pumps were supposed to work. So he should have known exactly what made those pumps work. So when he saw what was happening, he would have known it was something that had the potential of being serious. Okay, I'll hide the results. Very good. Very good identification of the links. All right, when the airplane arrived at Nut Tree, the pilot refueled the airplane at the airport's self-service fueling island with about 128 gallons of Jet A. At this point, the fuel tanks would most likely have been refilled to their max capacity. The fuel dispensed at the Nut Tree self-service fueling island was not pre-mixed with Prist, and the fuel pump did not even contain provisions for injecting Prist during refueling. Still could be done manually by activating the valve on the Prist can with your other hand as you're shooting fuel in. So he could have done it. No evidence suggests that the pilot used any other method to add Prist to the fuel, either before or during the fueling. No evidence suggested that the pilot had used any other method to add Prist to the fuel, either before or during the fueling. Surveillance video obtained from Nut Tree showed the pilot performing some parts of the required pre-flight inspection. However, the video showed no evidence that the pilot had sampled fuel from either of the underwing fuel drain tanks or the fuel filter drains. Also, the surveillance video did not show any evidence that the pilot examined the fuel filter bypass indicator to ensure that it was flush with the filter housing assembly. So the fuel filter had a bypass, had a little button or a little rod or however it was designed that would pop out if there had been a bypass of the filter. And so that's part of the pre-flight on this airplane. If he had checked it in a post-flight or in a pre-flight, that would have been another clue that something was going on with that fuel system that wasn't right. But he didn't complete a good pre-flight. The second flight plan indicated that 5 occupants, including the pilot, would be on board for the flight from Nut Tree up to Oroville, where they were going to pick up some more passengers. 10 occupants actually boarded the airplane at Nut Tree. So he had a flight planned for 5. 5 more showed up, 10. But the max passenger load on the airplane is 9. So he had to make a decision here to overload the airplane, which he did. Okay, another poll question for you. Oops, so hang on, I got the wrong button here. Okay, do you think that the pilot's overloading of the airplane is a link in the error chain? Still voting? Okay, I think everyone's voted. I'll close it, share it with you. And we can see that 90% think yes and 10% think no. I would agree with you yesers, because that's now we're starting to see a pattern where he's breaking regulations, not following procedures, exceeding limitations. That's a pattern you look for in what we call a rogue aviator, somebody who's a dangerous pilot that's going to get himself in trouble. Okay, let me hide that one. Move on. Okay, hang on a second. You guys are not seeing what you're supposed to be seeing right now. There it is. Okay, I don't know how that happened. Somehow the button to unshow my screen got hit. The electronic instrumentation system flight summary data showed that during the short flight from Nut Tree to Oroville, the airplane operated at a maximum altitude of 6,000 feet, where the outside air temperature was about a -4. And the airplane was exposed to a higher outside air temperature than that first leg, or that he will experience on the third leg. And so that's outside of that fuel icing area that the Prist is put in there to prevent. However, Prist was still required per the AFM for the flight. So even though it was warmer, it was still required. The crew alert and warning system, this is a picture of it out of the PC-12, did not log any fuel boost pump activity for this flight. If it had, it would have shown these left fuel pump or right fuel pump on. The fuel consumption estimate for the flight on that second leg was about 200 pounds. Remember, he topped it off at the first stop, and then he consumed about 200 pounds going up to the second stop. Now, the third leg of the flight, the accident leg, started out here in Oroville, California, and the destination was Bozeman, Montana, with a named alternate of Burt Mooney up in Butte, Montana. About 3 hours ETE. Just to orient you a little bit further, give you a little different perspective here, that show you some of the environmental factors on this flight. There's Oroville, down by Chico. There's Bozeman, the destination, and there's Burt Mooney up in Butte, the alternate. Down here we have Salt Lake, and up here is Seattle, Tacoma. So very inhospitable terrain, mountainous terrain, and a fairly long flight for that kind of airplane on that kind of mission. So environmental, he had a lot of environmental factors that he needed to take into consideration. When the airplane arrived at Oroville, 4 additional passengers boarded the airplane. That brought the total number of airplane occupants to 14 people. The pilot, 6 adult passengers, 7 child passengers aged 1 to 9. The NTSB said the pilot was aware that the airplane would have only 9 seats available to the 13 passengers. So he was way overloaded on the flight. Now you say, well, why would a very experienced guy like that decide to do it? Well, we've already seen he's got a bit of a pattern here of getting away with breaking the regs or ignoring things. But also, when you're in that kind of a job, and it depends on you making these folks happy all the time, you have a tendency to get in the mode of trying to do that and not saying no to them. Since there were kids involved, and since he never did a weight and balance, he didn't know how far over gross he was at takeoff, although we saw earlier he was over gross. I think he just kind of did a, well, I can get away with this, and they'll just hang on to the kids. Well, the regs say the kids have to be at least under 2 to be held, and otherwise they have to be strapped in, and we don't know if the kids were strapped in or not on the top of an adult's lap. We don't know, but a lot of non-standard things were going on at this point. And by the way, I wanted to say, I got myself in a situation. I flew a Conquest 2 twin-engine turboprop in a corporate job for about 1,200 hours. And I kind of got into this. I put a couple people on. There wasn't any max loading. I didn't exceed that. But I put 3 extra people in a little couch area way in the tail of this 441. And it had 3 seat belts, but it was really for kids. And putting the 3 adults back there, I was right at the aft CG limit, and the airplane was a bit squirrely. I was legal, but later on I said to myself, never again, because if I had lost an engine, of course, that aft CG reduces your ability to control the airplane in an asymmetric thrust situation. So I might have gotten myself, that might have been the first link in an air chain that took me down. So even very experienced pilots, as we're seeing here, can make bad judgments or borderline judgments with thinking they've got it under control. The NTSB said the pilot should have been aware that the AFM limitation allowing more than 9 passengers to be aboard the PC-12, probably because the training programs that they have to approve all contain going over the limitations, which they all do. The airplane departed Oroville for Bozeman about 12:10, so in the middle of the day, with an estimated 1,268 pounds of fuel in each tank, so assuming equilateral burn from the actually second leg of the flight from Nut Tree up to Oroville. So they had a lot of fuel, is the bottom line there. According to the cause data, the crew alerting and warning system data, about 22 minutes into the flight, or about 12:32, the right fuel boost pump was continuously on for 3 minutes and 45 seconds. Now, the way that pump's supposed to work, if it's set in the auto mode, it's only supposed to come on if the senses a fuel imbalance, and it only comes on to pump fuel out of the high tank into the low tank, and then it goes off after it's equalized, or if it senses a low fuel pressure. So in this case, it was sensing imbalance, so it came on and it started running fuel from the right tank over to the left tank. This activity was consistent with normal operation of the automatic fuel balancing system to laterally balance the fuel load. At the time, the EIS fuel quantity indicator would have displayed a 2-bar differential between the left and right fuel tanks, with the right tank containing more fuel. So 2 bars, you can see that's 28 bars there total. Yeah, you'd notice it, I think, but it's not real noticeable. And there's indicator here the guy was flying on autopilot most of the time, so he probably wasn't feeling the problem at that time. It was only a 70-pound fuel imbalance, right wing heavy. But once the 70-pound imbalance was corrected, the right fuel pump would have turned off. The fuel quantity indicator would no longer have shown a fuel imbalance. The cause did not log any further fuel pump activity for the next 45 minutes. So that looked like a normal operation, balanced the fuel, everything went back to normal. So that's a confusing clue if you're trying to hook all these dots together from the indications on the prior flights. Now the fuel system's operating normally. About 1:13 into the flight, both fuel boost pumps began cycling because of low fuel pressure states. Now, pilot didn't know it was low fuel pressure. He just started seeing those lights coming on and off, both sides on and off, which is not a normal indication anytime. He didn't know it was from low fuel or if it was something, low fuel pressure, or something to do with the balancing, something wrong maybe with the sensors to balance the fuel. So confusing indications. EIS trend data showed that the airplane was operating at the time at its cruise altitude, and the average outside air temperature was -40, much below the required temperature to freeze water in the fuel. So it was cold enough to put ice crystals in the fuel. Both fuel boost pumps continued cycling during the next 4.5 minutes, so that very unusual indication kept going for quite a while. No low fuel pressure cautions were logged during the flight, indicating that the low fuel pressure state was alleviated by the operation of one or both fuel boost pumps. So the boost pumps were not responding to the imbalance at this point. They were responding to low fuel pressure. Low fuel pressure that they were sensing. But there was really no way for the pilot to know what was causing them to cycle. The fuel pumps continued to cycle on and off, and the fuel imbalance grew. Time is going by while all this is happening. The pilot had most likely recognized the fuel imbalance sometime between 1:21 and 1:32 into the flight and responded by repositioning the left fuel boost pump switch from its auto to its on, because remember now we're getting more fuel in the left tank. That might be that's a pretty logical thought, is, well, if I'm not getting the fuel out of that tank in auto, why don't I turn that boost pump on? And the fuel boost pump switches, they're push-push switches up there on the overhead on this airplane, you can't quite see that, but that's the auto position and that's the on. So he cycled it from auto to on. Auto was normal. So another poll question for you. Stand by. I'm going to read this to you before I put it up because I can't see the whole question after I launch it. Do you think the pilot's use of a non-standard procedure was a link to the error chain? And there you have it. Yes or no? A few more to vote. Okay, looks like everybody's voted. I'm going to close it and share it with you. There it is, and almost everybody thinks yes, 85% thinks no. And that turning that left fuel pump to on from auto is not the procedure. So that's a good indicator right there. Again, that's been shown over and over using a non-standard procedure has been shown over and over to be a link in an error chain. So good catch on those of you that caught that. Okay, I'm going to hide that. Stand by just one while I check for hands up. I haven't done that in a while, and I don't want to leave anybody hanging here if they've got questions or comments. Okay, looks like a clear board there. I'm going back to the other view. Okay. The left fuel pump, boost pump, was on continuously, and the right fuel boost pump was cycling until 1 hour and 52 into the flight. So this is going on and on, these unusual indications, and this guy trying to figure it out. At the time, the left fuel boost pump was off for 11 seconds and then on continuously. Also, the right fuel boost pump was on continuously for 20 seconds and then resumed cycling. The brief change in the status of both fuel boost pumps was most likely induced by the pilot. So that means he was trying this auto on back and forth on the two boost pumps to try to figure out what was going on and to try to get the load balanced, and nothing was working. Anybody ever been there? Specifically, the pilot most likely recognized that the fuel imbalance was not being corrected, and as a result repositioned the left fuel boost pump switch from on to auto and the right boost pump switch to auto to on to observe the effect that changed the switch that the changed switch state would have on the fuel boost pump's operation. So that's what the safety board said. Same thing I just said. This action allowed the left fuel boost pump to remain on continuously regardless of the commands from the automatic fuel balancing system or the automatic activation of the standby one of the pump in response to the low pressure fuel state. The fuel imbalance continued to increase. So this table shows us different times in the flight. So we're up here about 2:10 in. You can see the left tank 1368, the right 274 pounds, about almost 1,100 pound difference, 23 bars, 23 segments of difference on that. And then it just continues to get worse. The segments to where here at the last reading, he's got a 1,300 pound difference between the two wings. At about 2:17 in the flight, the cause enunciated a right fuel low caution light. So now we got a new light on. It's an amber light, so it's a little more higher. It's a higher priority than the green light, and it says right fuel low, which tells him, of course, that the fuel in the right tank is now low, and he can see that on his gauge. The fuel load at the time of the right fuel low caution was estimated to be 1368 in the left and 149 in the right, which was a 1,200 pound difference. And on that kind of airplane, that's starting to become a huge difference. And it was a 26 bar difference there. So that should have shown up in addition to those caution and warning lights. That should have been very obvious to him. Probably was, because obviously he was trying to solve the problem. 5 seconds later, the right fuel boost pump turned on continuously and remained on until the end of the flight. The left fuel boost pump had been on continuous since 1426 and remained on through then until the end of the flight. The time of the last cause entries for the flight was about 1433. The fuel imbalance would have been displayed to the pilot as a 27 bar differential. Remember, there's 28 bars there. The right fuel boost pump was providing all of the fuel system pressure to the engine because the left side fuel system was no longer able to maintain the required fuel pressure through the operation of the left fuel boost pump, icing. At that time, the fuel pressure output was less than 2 psi, even with the left fuel boost pump on continuously, icing in the fuel filter. The circumstances resulting in the low fuel pressure state and the degraded performance of the left side fuel system were not resolved at any time during the flight. So what's the definition of insanity? Continue to do something over and over in the same way and getting the same results. So he was, if you follow that definition, in a state of insanity for a good part of this sequence of events here. He kept doing it over and over, couldn't get any different results. The NTSB concluded that the fuel system continued to provide fuel to the engine throughout the flight, even with the low fuel pressure state and the degraded performance of the left side fuel system. So they never ran it out. He never ran it out of fuel. The engine kept running right up till the time they hit the ground. Here's another aspect we need to look at, comes into the judgment and so forth. Radar data showed that at 1402, the pilot changed the airplane's route of flight and turned left towards Butte without an ATC clearance. He was on an IFR flight plan. The NTSB concluded that although the pilot should have diverted to a nearby airport once the maximum allowable fuel balance had been exceeded, the pilot eventually diverted to Butte likely because he recognized the magnitude of the situation and his attempts to resolve the increasing left-wing heavy fuel imbalance had been unsuccessful. So finally at 14:02 he says, I got to do something. I'm not going to get it fixed. And he'd been at it quite a while at this point. You can see here by the chart he was slightly closer to Butte than Bozeman. So that's probably his thinking there. However, we can see here in this graphic that at different times he had other bailouts. Here's the green. The green was at 13:30. He was pretty much balanced, but he was having the boost pump problems. He was only 10 minutes away from Boise. He was real close to a whole bunch of airports here along this initial sequence. So he had a lot of good bailouts if he would have gone with his first clue of just the weird indications. Then we can see here a little later on, we're starting to see the fuel imbalance, so that up here at 13:45, he's got a good imbalance going, but he still had some big, close bailout airports, a lot closer than going to Butte or continuing to Bozeman. Then, oops, I'm sorry. And here is, that's why I went by it, it's virtually the same looking chart, but further down the line here in timeline, we can see here that at 1400, he had a big imbalance, a lot of difference here in the gauge, but he still was, closest airport was only 4 minutes away, so he had closer bailouts, and he took it all the way up to where he had this major imbalance, and and he still had a bailout here at Dillon. It would have been a lot closer airport. So it wasn't just one poor judgment, it was a series of poor judgments. We'll never know why he was making that judgment. I think it had something to do with getting the people closer to where they wanted to go. Remember, they wanted to go to Bozeman, so I don't know why I guess in desperation he finally decided to go to Butte, but again, he could have gone to Dillon, and nobody knows why he decided not to go into Dillon. All right, I've got another poll question for you. Stand by while I crank her up here. Do you think the pilot's refusal to acknowledge his problem and divert was a link in the error chain? Okay, it looks like everybody has voted. I'll close it and share the results. And look at that. All of us pilots, a whole bunch of us here tonight, we all agree. Definitely was a link in the error chain, no doubt about it. All right, let me hide that and go back. The NTSB concludes that, this is a quote right out of the report, that if the pilot had diverted earlier in the flight to one of several suitable airports along the airplane's route of flight, the outcome of this flight would likely have been different, because the airplane would have had a less severe fuel imbalance, and the pilot would not have to contend with the airplane's deteriorating performance as the imbalance steadily progressed. So the NTSB agreed with our evaluation there. The pilot contacted the controller at 1403 to request a change in destination to Butte, but did not give a reason for his request. The controller then cleared the airplane direct to Butte. The airplane began descending from flight level 250, which was his assigned altitude, at 1404, so a minute after he made the request, but he had not been cleared out of 250. So now this is an indication of task overload, of getting behind the airplane, not staying situationally aware. At 1404.24, the pilot contacted the controller to request a lower altitude. So now he recognized he left his altitude without a clearance. Now he's asking for lower. The controller cleared the airplane to descend at the pilot's discretion to 14,000 feet. Cause data showed that about 1405, the autopilot was disengaged. So I alluded to this clue earlier. This tells me the guy probably didn't have the tactile input about the fuel imbalance, although all the intellectual input was there, the fuel gauges, the flashing lights, all that. But one of the cardinal rules is if you start having problems with an airplane that you can't figure out is if you have the autopilot on, get it off the autopilot so you can feel what the airplane is doing. So now, real late into the problem, he's taken it off the autopilot. He probably really had his hands full when he first took it off the autopilot. At 14:05:23, the pilot transmitted a second request to change the flight's destination to Butte, and the controller told him he already did that. So again, signs of task overload, getting behind the situation. At this point, the left fuel tank was 88 pounds under its max capacity. To compensate for this imbalance, the pilots likely manually inputted right aileron trim to maintain yacht level flight. I think that's a logical, a good assumption, and you'll see later there's evidence of that. Also, according to cause data, the pilot was still attempting to resolve the fuel imbalance by toggling the fuel boost pump switches laterally to balance the fuel. So he's diverting his attention to a task that he already knows isn't working, so he's kind of out of ideas and probably maybe even inching up towards a panic mode at this point. Be my guess. At 14:06, the controller instructed the pilot to advise receipt of Butte, Montana weather and NOTAM, standard call by ATC. The pilot responded Wilco. That's another sign, somewhat subtle, but he's using non-standard radio phraseology. That has been shown to be a sign of a link in an error chain. So he used non-standard. It's an old Air Force term, so he probably just defaulted to that. He was in task overload. But that's an indication. Now also, you'll show this ATC communications here. The magic words never show up. The magic words, I'm declaring an emergency. So the controller is handling him at this point pretty much like a normal flight. However, the ATC transcript showed the pilot did not acknowledge receipt of the weather or the NOTAMs, so task overload. Cause data indicated that at about 14:09, either the autopilot or yaw damper was engaged. It's likely that the pilot engaged the yaw damper, and these are what the experts on the airplane think, independent of the autopilot, to center any yawing and rolling oscillations that the airplane was experiencing. My opinion, a very bad idea, because again, it takes a lot of that feel away from you, and a yaw damper, an automatic yaw damper, can actually work against you in this kind of a situation. So I think he was grasping at straws at this point. Cause data further indicated that from about 14:15 to 26, the pilot continued his efforts to resolve the fuel imbalance and laterally balance the fuel load. So again, wasting his time and attention, distracting himself, probably getting himself into a bigger hole mentally because he can't solve this problem and it's getting worse. And he's probably thinking he's going to run out of fuel because because the right tank is going down. I think a logical assumption was the right tank was feeding the engine and it's almost empty, so he's got to get to the airport. So building up, that pressure is building up, links in the air chain. So got another poll question for you here. I apologize for those of you who expected this to be an hour. I just finished this presentation up today, and I discovered that it was going to go more than an hour because there's so much detail here. But you've all met your requirements for the Wings Program credit. So if you're starting to fall asleep or you're starting to get tired of hearing me talk, please feel free to retire from the webinar. We're almost to the end. I'd guess maybe another 15 minutes here to bring it to the gate and set the parking brake. If you can't stay around, this is being recorded, so it'll be up on the Center for Airmanship Excellence website in a few days, and you can go catch the end of it. So, and if you do decide to hang in there, I appreciate it. So let's launch this poll. Let me see what the question is. Do you think the fact that the pilot was experiencing task overload was a link in the error chain? Okay, hang on a second. Hang on just one second. I'm not getting the indication here that I'm expecting. Okay, I didn't click the right one. Here we go. I'm launching it. There you go. Okay, I'm going to close the poll, share the results. And there you have it. 98% say yes, 2% say no. So most of us agree that he was, the clues are that he was experiencing task overload, and that always is a link in an error chain if it's present. Okay, let me hide that. So now that popped out of my screen. You didn't have my screen view, and I didn't hit that button. So something happened. Why is it doing that, right? That's what we always say about automation. Okay, we should be set to proceed. Radar data showed that the airplane descended below 12,000 feet, which was the minimum IFR altitude for the area, but remember it was VMC up there, at 1426.49 and continued descending. So he was heading down for the airport. About this time, the cause enunciated the right fuel low caution. The Pilatus PC-12 FAM required pilots, upon receiving this caution, to land as soon as possible. So that just added a little pressure. He was already heading in that direction, though. Even though the pilot was required to comply with the previously issued ATC altitude restriction, because remember, he had never declared an emergency, of 13,000 feet until he had the airport in sight, he could provide his own terrain clearance, and it's likely that he continued his descent to the terminal area without clearance to do so because the airplane was likely becoming increasingly difficult to control. So he was kind of, in that dead heat to get it on the ground before he ran out of control authority. At that point, the left fuel tank was filled to capacity, and the right fuel tank contained 133 pounds of usable. So there was a big imbalance, a 26-bar differential. At 14:27:27, the controller advised the pilot that Butte was at his 12 o'clock position, 12 miles away. The pilot indicated that the airport would be in sight as soon as we get past one more cloud. So there were some broken clouds in the area, adding to his challenge of finding the airport. And as you recall from that satellite shot, he was, and the facts, he was not familiar, we don't think, with Butte, and that was a complicated valley or set of valleys he was descending into. At 14:28:43, the pilot reported that he had the airport in sight and canceled his IFR clearance. So something finally started going for him. The controller then instructed the pilot to squawk VFR, which is normal because he is still, no emergency declared. Radar data showed that the airplane was 8 miles southwest of Butte at an altitude of 11.1, which was 5,500 feet above the ground, so very high, 8 miles out. The airplane continued to squawk the previously assigned discrete transponder code for the next minute and a half, which task overload, again, a good indicator of that. Pilot never got around to either hearing it or doing it for sure. The last recorded radar target at 14:30:25 showed that the airplane was at an altitude of 9,100 feet or 3,550 AGL, about 1.8 miles southwest of the runway 33 threshold. So he should have been, at that point, about 500 to 600 feet above AGL rather than 3,550. So he was way high to make that runway. At that time, the airplane had a 1,302-pound imbalance, so he was, really, really out of balance at that point. The fuel quantity indicator would have been displaying a 27-bar differential between the left and right fuel tanks. The calculated ground speed between the final two radar targets was about 189 knots, so he was moving pretty good. This airplane in the pattern, you'd have it down at this point to 110 knots probably, or maybe 100 knots. So he was diving for the airport, obviously. Butte is located at an elevation of 5,550, so the airplane needed to descend 3,550 feet within that 1.8 miles. So he would have had to, push it over and do a Stuka dive bombing attack at 5,000 feet per minute rate of descent. That close to the ground, that close in, that in itself is highly dangerous, but that's what he did. Witnesses to the accident reported the airplane was approaching runway 33 at a higher altitude than most airplanes that land at the airport. One of the witnesses stated that the airplane appeared to fly directly toward the end of the runway, but seemed to be at too high an altitude to complete the landing. So he must have felt that he was losing control because of the imbalance, and he had to get it on the ground no matter what. The witnesses further stated that the airplane flew northwest away from the runway and entered a sharp left turn at an estimated altitude of 300 feet AGL. So when he got it down there, he wasn't in position, so he started a steep left turn. Mountainous terrain in the area would have prevented him from making a right turn, so he had to make that left turn. The witnesses reported seeing the airplane roll to the left before entering a steep bank, pitching down and impacting the ground. Classic signs of a stall spin. Records evidence indicated that the landing gear was extended and the flaps were fully retired to the impact. So he had the gear down, but he hadn't used the flaps for any additional drag to make that steep descent. Tough call, you know, with the controllability problems. I'd be reluctant to put flaps down, but you know, he was clean. Post-accident examination of the engine revealed no evidence of any mechanical abnormalities that would have precluded the engine from producing rated power. No mechanical anomalies associated with the engine were recorded by the EIS or the cause. Physical signatures observed during the engine and propeller post-accident examinations were consistent with the engine operating in a mid to high power condition at impact. So loss of power was not the problem here. The airplane would have still flown. The NTSB found aileron trim actuator fully extended, right wing down aileron trim. So as I mentioned earlier, that assumption about him cranking in the trim was a good one because they found evidence of that. The rudder trim actuator was also found fully extended, which correlated to an aircraft nose left rudder trim. Remember, heavy in the left wing, so you wouldn't have aircraft nose left. You'd have aircraft nose right, but the actuator was found extended fully in the aircraft nose left trim position. The rudder trim function of the yaw damper system had likely trimmed the rudder full left. So there's another reason, or reiterates what I said earlier about turning on a yaw damper. You're not sure what it's doing, and sometimes it can do what you don't want it to do. In this case, it did. This rudder trim position, along with the aileron trim position, would have placed the airplane in a forward right slip. Remember, he's making a left turn, and he's got left wing heavy, but he's in a forward right slip, which would indicate that would be inconsistent with the heavy left wing fuel balance, but would be consistent with him doing a slip to try to increase drag without increasing airspeed and get it down to the runway. And that's good pilot technique normally, but he's flying an airplane that's barely controllable in a fairly aggressive slip here to lose altitude close to the ground. The full aircraft nose left rudder trim would also have increased the control wheel forces required for the pilot to remain control of the airplane. It would have increased the amount of right control wheel force, aileron control force required. Post-accident calculations prepared by Pilatus indicated that a fuel imbalance of about 1,300 pounds, which is about where he was at, would require 22 degrees or 55% of the aileron's full 40 degree range. So that a 20-pound control wheel force would have been required, which is less than the 50-pound maximum control wheel force allowed by certification. So, and with that adrenaline flowing, he could have handled 50. So he still had controllability, they think. This was an analysis. Of course, they weren't in the airplane. This was the engineers and the aerodynamicists came up with the analysis. Pilatus' calculation indicated the airplane would have been controllable to an airspeed of about 90 knots, and they think he was flying at a much higher airspeed the whole time, which is just below the PC-12 stall speed of 93 with that particular fuel imbalance situation. As the pilot maneuvered the airplane near the approach end of the runway, a steep descent was developed. The impact damage and ground scars showed that the airplane was still in a substantial descent, but near wings level when it impacted the ground. So either he got enough control to overcome the left roll and got it level by the time he hit, or that was just about the way it happened with the spin. That's how it turned out. A large left roll angle also was developing during the maneuver. So here are the conclusions. Coming down to the end, NTSB conclusions and findings. Very interesting. The NTSB concludes that the airplane was controllable in static flight with the wings, left wing heavy fuel imbalance that existed at the time of the accident. So the NTSB agrees that this airplane was controllable when it hit the ground. Theoretically, anyhow. But that the pilot did not maintain control of the airplane with the dynamic maneuvers during the final moments of the flight. Let me back up to that. So if he had not been so aggressive in his maneuvers, if he had just flown a more realistic pattern, it wouldn't. But he was forced into it in his mind by thinking he was almost out of control when he still had some control left, and he could have done some other things. But he rushed it. He got into dynamic maneuvering, and that's where he got beyond the control authority that he had left. The investigation found that the pilot was properly certificated and qualified in accordance with the regs. The investigation also found no evidence indicating that pre-existing medical or behavioral condition that might have adversely affected the pilot performance on the day of the accident. However, I would submit that if you were studying airmanship and you study airmanship 2.0, you would say that he was exhibiting rogue pilot behavior and he was an accident waiting to happen. So, but the NTSB isn't looking at accidents quite that way yet. The investigation found that the airplane was properly certified, equipped, and maintained in accordance with the regs, and that all of the recovered components showed no evidence of any pre-impact structural, engine, or system failures. So, pilot error, pilot-induced accident. The low fuel pressure state and the restricted fuel supply from the left tank during the accident flight were the result of an accumulation of ice in the fuel system, with an initial concentrated amount of ice at the airframe fuel filter. So that got clogged up with ice. If the pilot had added a fuel system icing inhibitor to the fuel for the flights on the day of the accident, as required, the ice accumulation in the fuel system would have been avoided and the left wing heavy fuel imbalance would not have developed. Remember, that was required by the AFM. If the pilot had performed a complete pre-flight inspection before the flight to Oroville, he would have had an opportunity to detect whether ice crystals or water were present in the fuel and determine whether the fuel filter bypass indicator was extended, which could have explained the reason for the fuel boost pump advisories enunciating during the preceding flight, or at least given him another clue to go ask somebody who knew the system what was going on. About 1:21 into the flight, the fuel supplied to the airplane's engine was being drawn solely from the right tank by the right fuel boost pump, and the left wing heavy fuel imbalance continued to increase. Again, these are NTSB conclusions and findings. The left and right fuel tanks were equally receiving fuel through the fuel return lines, but the left wing heavy fuel imbalance continued to increase during the flight because fuel was only being drawn from the right tank. The fuel system continued to provide fuel to the engine throughout the flight, even with the low fuel pressure state and the degraded performance of the left side fuel system. Maybe not for a whole lot longer, but certainly long enough. He had more time to get the airplane on the ground than he took. Although the pilot should have diverted to a nearby airport once the maximum allowable fuel imbalance had been exceeded, which is in the book, the pilot eventually diverted to Burt Mooney and Butte, likely because he recognized finally the magnitude of the situation, and his attempts to resolve the increasingly left-wing heavy fuel imbalance had been unsuccessful. And I would say ludicrously persistent attempts to solve the problem. He should have stopped much earlier with those attempts to solve the problem. The airplane was controllable in static flight with the left wing heavy fuel imbalance that existed at the time of the accident, but the pilot lost control of the airplane with dynamic maneuvers during the final moments of the flight. He almost made it. The large left rolling moment induced by the left wing heavy fuel imbalance could have been minimized or even avoided if the pilot had followed the required procedures in the AFM. If the pilot had diverted earlier to one of the several suitable airports along the route, the outcome of this flight would likely have been different because the airplane would have had less severe fuel imbalance and the pilot would not have had to contend with the airplane's deteriorating performance as the imbalance steadily progressed. The pilot underestimated the seriousness of the initial fuel imbalance warnings because he had not experienced any adverse outcomes from ignoring the similar previous warnings. And we find that this is a setup for a fall in airmanship over and over and over again. You get away with something first time, second time, third time, but that doesn't mean you're always going to get away with it. So he was setting himself up for this fall. The safety hazard involving fuel system ice accumulation could have been mitigated if fuel filter placards installed on the aircraft requiring the fuel system icing inhibitor specified that requirement. So his team let him down here. The FAA, the manufacturer, if they put that placard right on that hole that he put that fuel in, maybe he would have used it. Who knows? This guy was obviously flaunting the procedure, though. FAA pilot and operator guidance on the use of the fuel system icing inhibitor would help raise awareness of the need to include this additive in turbine engine powered aircraft fuel system that require the additive. I agree with that. It's not emphasized enough in initial and recurrent training, at least when I was doing it for these guys. At least 4 of the 7 children on board the airplane were not restrained or were improperly restrained. I think, in my mind, this is criminal. If this guy had lived, they should have put him up, because nobody can hang on to the weight of a child in a crash sequence with their arms. It's impossible. The forces are too high. So if you've got a kid on your lap and you go through a crash sequence, the kid's going to get killed, or at the very least very seriously injured. So that's poor decision making on the parents' part, on the pilot's part. He should know that, but most of them, 4 of the 7, weren't restrained. Although the number of passengers on board the airplane during the final leg did not comply with the PC-12 airplane flight manual limitation requiring no more than 9 passengers, the 4 additional passengers on board the airplane did not directly affect the outcome of the accident. So that's the board's conclusion. Now, I think they kind of missed it here. If you count all the fatalities, then it counted, that affected the outcome there, but it wasn't a link in the air chain. It's an indicator that this pilot was flaunting regs and procedures, which is a link in the air chain. For survivable accidents, passengers aboard airplanes operating under Part 91 would be afforded better crash protection if each seat and restraint system were limited to only 1 passenger and children less than 2 years of age were restrained in approved child restraint. So this is something to think about if you're taking kids flying. I would never put a kid in a seatbelt with an adult. Think about that. They're going to get crushed with that weight and the force of the adult against them in the seatbelt. And they're make a nice airbag for the adult, but it's hard on the kid. If you don't have any kind of restraint, they're going to go flying. So the best thing is they should have their own seatbelt, or being a child, and better if they're under 4 or 8 or 10 or whatever the rule is for cars, in a child seat, an approved child seat. The rule says, by the way, you can put 2 people of no more than 170 pounds under Part 91 in one seatbelt. I think that's a totally nuts rig. Although the download of the non-volatile memory data provided key information in determining the circumstance that led to this accident, a flight data recorder system that captured cockpit audio, images, and parametric data would have provided additional information about the accident that was not possible to determine from the downloaded non-volatile memory data. This is a big part of Airmanship 2.0, flight data recording, and then flight data analysis and trend analysis and so forth. And so this is part of the Airmanship 2.0 thing that he didn't have, the insurance policy didn't have. The NTSB has been saying this on almost all of the accident reports that I've been seeing, that they want to have this in all the cockpits of all the airplanes, and I agree with them. Heck of a safety tool, not only for the NTSB to analyze accidents, but for all of us to use in our personal post-flight analysis of what we did, how we did on that flight. Now we come down to the NTSB probable cause. The NTSB determines that the probable cause of this accident was, number 1, the pilot's failure to ensure that a fuel system icing inhibitor was added to the fuel before the flights on the day of the accident. Number 2, his failure to take appropriate remedial actions after a low fuel pressure state resulting from icing within the fuel system, which, by the way, he never seemed to figure out, and a lateral fuel imbalance developed, including diverting to a suitable airport before the fuel imbalance became extreme, and a loss of control while the pilot was maneuvering the left-wing heavy airplane near the approach end of the runway. So those are the probable causes of the accident according to the NTSB. So I just want to take a couple of minutes here, less than 5, hopefully here. I think we can do it that fast because we're almost at the end of the webinar, and I appreciate all you guys hanging in there. But I want to show you how this fits into Airmanship 2.0. As I mentioned, we use the current airmanship model as the scaffold for Airmanship 2.0. So let's just think about this just a minute, what we've seen here, the links we've seen in the air chain that came together to cause this accident, and how if this guy was practicing Airmanship 2.0 or the flight was operating within Airmanship 2.0, it would have been avoided. First of all, let's look at discipline, the first bedrock principle of Airmanship 2.0. This guy had poor discipline. He wasn't following prescribed procedures. He was becoming a rogue aviator. Discipline in his life, flight discipline, had obviously become a problem, and that's a problem for his airmanship. Skill. I'd say he had pretty good skill. He had a lot of time. Of course, skill is dependent. You got to keep those sharp, which results in proficiency. He'd been flying maybe not quite enough to be at the peak of proficiency, but he did just come out of training, so his skill level was probably way up there, and his proficiency was probably more than adequate for the basic flight. Now, as we see, his stick and rudder skills in the end proved to do him in. Because he used that forward slip at a bad time. So his proficiency and skill levels were not where they should be. Knowledge itself, not very good. He wasn't watching for these warning signs that would have told him he was starting to slip with skill, and that the warning signs, he should have had his personal warning signs and what's starting to show links and error chains showing up. He obviously didn't have good aircraft knowledge, systems knowledge. He didn't have much of any team knowledge because there wasn't much of any team around him. He didn't have much knowledge of his environment. Just one example is the fact that he was flying at the cold altitudes with no PRIST. He had no, it didn't appear he has any methodical risk assessment, so therefore he didn't have a methodical way to have knowledge of all the risks involved with the flight. Therefore, because he had deficiencies in the 3 pillars, or the 3 bedrock foundations and the 5 pillars of knowledge, his situational awareness was no good. Obviously, he didn't divert early enough like he should have, and he had all the opportunity, and therefore his judgment failed him all the way through several times. So that's how we would look at a crash analysis like we just did by using the Airmanship 2.0 current airmanship model. And, oops, I'm sorry, I had given us some props there. Let me just go through that. Forgotten I'd done that. So a couple of other items just to round it out here on Airmanship 2.0, how it could have prevented it. This guy had no safety culture. A safety culture requires a group of people working, living together, playing together, socially interacting, who are participating in a formal aviation safety culture. This guy was pretty much out there on his own. He was a contract pilot. There's no indication there were any other pilots in his group, no indication he was doing any other kind of flying in a group, so he didn't have any safety culture. In Airmanship 2.0, you fly within a strong safety culture. No shared decision making. He was making his own go no-go decisions. He had no support. He probably didn't have a flat sat phone in the airplane, or even if he didn't have a operations center to back him up. So when he started getting those screwy indications, he couldn't. If he was flying under Airmanship 2.0, he'd pick up his sat phone, call the ops center. They'd get the duty maintenance manager who'd get the expert on the Pilatus. They'd get the books out, and they'd figure out what was going on. So he had no support, no shared decision-making, no shared decision-making on the go, no-go decisions, nobody to keep him in check on overloading the airplane, and so forth. No check and balance system. No safety management system in his operation. And you would have all of these things in Airmanship 2.0, and if he had these would have eliminated several of the links in the error chain that he built. So I have one final poll question for you. Let me get her launched here. Do you think this pilot would have made the mistakes he did if he had been practicing Airmanship 2.0? Let me launch that one. There you go. Okay, looks like everybody has voted. I'm closing it. Share it with you. 10% think yes, and 90% think no. And I agree, of course, with you 90%ers there. All right, let me hide that. And, okay. Are there any questions or comments? This is your last chance at that this evening. So I'm scanning the roster for hands up. I see Steve Acerbi has a hand up. Steve, I'll open up your mic. Go ahead.
Thanks, Dave. Going over the whole chain of this earlier, in the middle of the presentation, we came up with the fact that the pilot was continually toggling the pump switches on and off, continually trying to make a change. But obviously, we understand what the result of the flight was. What else could this pilot, single pilot, have been doing under an IFR flight? What else should he have been doing?
Well, good question. I'm going to close your mic so I can get the feedback, Stephen. He should have had the discipline and the training in unusual situations, emergency situations, cockpit resource management, to know that when you keep doing the same sequence of events over with the same result, that you're at a dead end. So that's the first thing. He wasted a lot of time. He distracted himself. And I won't get into this war story right now, but there's a very appropriate war story here that I always tell when I'm teaching jet flying. And I was teaching, I started teaching this when I was teaching the Challenger. And that's a dual engine failure on a 2-engine jet. And there are two major examples of this that happened in the U.S., both of them, one of them in a Challenger and the other in a CRJ, which is a version of the Challenger. And when these guys got the double engine failures, two-pilot crew, they distracted themselves way too long with trying to get the engine started when they were doing a procedure that was never going to get the engine started, and their lack of system knowledge kept them from understanding that. But so they diverted what they were doing. In both of those cases, if they would have paid attention to what was going on earlier in the sequence and diverted to an airport within range of their glide, they at least would have gotten over the airport. Then if they would have had the skill to get it on, they might have walked away. But they didn't do that. They caught up in that loop of trying to fix the problem with a procedure that was never going to fix it. Those pumps, the way I understand it, have never been trained on the PC-12. I've flown about 3 hours in one. But the way I understand it, there's just really two positions. Auto, which then, auto balancing, or if it senses low fuel pressure, or on. And on is just it runs continuously. So there was no magic in those sequence of switch sequences there. It was just, on or off, or on or auto. So that's what I mean by that being a link in the air chain. There really was nothing more he could do with that fuel system. So his knowledge was insufficient for analyzing the problem. So and raise your hand again, Stephen, if that didn't answer it, or if you have something to add to it. Okay, I see that satisfied you. Let me take a look for any other hands. Okay, here's one. Jesus Berrientos. Jesus, I've got your mic open. Go ahead.
You said that well. Can you hear me? I'm wondering if you could hear me.
I can hear you loud and clear. Go ahead.
Having mic problems. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. I can hear you loud and clear.
Hello.
Okay, Jesus, I guess you're not hearing me. All right. I can hear
you just fine.
Okay, Jesus, go ahead. We got you loud and clear.
Okay, good. All right. Thanks for taking my question. See, I don't have a lot of flight time, but my question that goes out to you and anybody else that's listening. When do you think this situation went from an urgent situation to an emergency situation? Because he never actually called out Mayday or never did the whole pan-pan situation. My question would be, in your professional opinion, was it when he exceeded the fuel imbalance that was listed in the manual, or I'll let you take it from there.
Exactly. Good observation, Jesus. I'm going to close your mic because of feedback. Good observation, because the the way you learn cockpit resource management and handling situation is that the minute you exceed a limitation on the airplane, you are either in an abnormal or an emergency situation. And you should then declare an emergency, because it's there's no penalty for declaring an emergency. You never even have to write letters unless you, you know, it was an obvious, you declared the emergency to cover up an obvious violation. But I've declared an emergency, never had to write a letter. I ask everybody I've ever trained if they declare an emergency. If they say yes, I ask them if they had to write a letter. Nobody's had to write a letter. So it's a get out of jail free card. It's a cover your tail card. It's a get help card. It's the right thing to do as soon as you are in an emergency situation. I agree with you, Jesus. The minute he exceeded that imbalance limitation is where he should have declared the emergency and diverted to the nearest suitable airport. All right, let me see if there's some any more hands up here. Oh boy, we got a lot of hands. I'm going to catch two more because I know we're running late. Most everybody's hung in here, but we got a few guys dropping off. So I'm going to give Frank Blair. I'm going to open up your mic, Frank. Can you hear me, Frank Blair?
Yeah, I'm on. Can you hear me okay?
Loud and clear, Frank. Go ahead.
Okay. First, I wanted to say it was very good presentation and makes you believe in PRIS, but I thought your conclusion sequence was not very well tuned to your audience. The whole get on your sat phone and, you know, call your maintenance specialist, just, you know, it isn't in 98% of people you're talking to's ammunition box or whatever. But I think what you just said to the last guy, and I put my hand up before, is when you have a bunch of things going on, you land. And certainly anytime you have a 50% fuel imbalance, you know it's sick, your plane is sick, something's terribly wrong. You don't necessarily know what's wrong, but you just stop and you land closest. And it's shocking to me that he flew over so many places where he could and his passengers could have lived, and you know, didn't do so.
I agree, Frank. Two very good observations there. I've muted your mic because of feedback. The first observation that you know, he should have diverted. There were enough clues, enough warnings. When you get that many things going on, you get the airplane on the ground. That's a very good observation. I agree with you. The second observation about talking about the sat phones and so forth, that is another good observation. Let me clarify that. I talked about that in the context of if you're practicing Airmanship 2.0, that's the kind of way you want to fly. Remember we talked about Airmanship 2.0 was doing it right, and the doing it right was our definition of doing it right. Yes, we know that not everybody can afford to have a sat phone. It's not practical in every case, but our point of view is that that's part of Airmanship 2.0. You should be doing that if you can. So I'll leave my comment at that. I'm going to take one more, and Frank Bacon, you've had your hand up for quite a while. Go ahead, Frank.
Well, Dave, reason I put my hand up is that my wife and I have flown that route several times in both the King Air and in our Archer, and we were quite familiar with the terrain there. And one of the reasons he probably did not divert to Dillon, that's a much smaller airport, although and it's quite mountainous, quite a bit around it, around Dillon, because that might have given him an excuse for not going there. But also where he did go, the Bozeman airport was much better, and he probably wouldn't have had to make that maneuver at the last instant if he'd gone into Bozeman instead. The other thing I picked up on that is if he's flying, if he turns out with a low left wing, it's kind of like having the wrong having an engine out, and he's cross control because he's got right aileron in to hold that left wing up, so he's cross controlled in his left turn, which exacerbated the stall condition.
So Peter McNamee. And by the way, Frank, those are excellent observations. I'm sorry I had my mic muted, so you didn't hear my response, but thank you for that local color, if you will, and I couldn't agree with you more. Peter McNamee, I've got your mic open. You have your hand up. Do you have a comment or question?
Yeah, I'm getting back into aviation after being out about 40 years. Can you hear me?
I can hear you loud and clear. Go ahead.
Okay, and the comments about the sat phone and stuff like that, isn't this guy's team ATC? In other words, he should have declared that emergency and he would have been plugged into some people that could have helped him.
Let me close your mic for the feedback, Peter. Yes, you're absolutely right. Good observation. That's why he should have declared that emergency. They would have helped him. But had he had the sat phone and a ops support center, just like the big guys do at the airlines, he would have had all those other resources. Yeah, I guess maybe if he would have called ATC and declared an emergency on that first leg, I've seen Airport, the movie, they can get experts on the phone and all that, but it's not a very efficient way to get that kind of support. But your observation is right on. He should have declared the emergency, and he would at least have his ATC team helping him, and in this case, they didn't know to give him any more help. They were just giving him standard support. Okay, well, that's very good comments and very good questions. And let me suggest these as your next steps. If you're interested in looking into Airmanship 2.0 any more detail. Register for Airmanship updates at the airmanshipexcellence.org website. Look for any of the web program briefings you missed. They're all posted there. And if you want to view Airmanship 2.0 briefings, they're there. A lot of information. Subscribe to my blog, Captain Dave's Hangar. It's all about airmanship. Watch for Airmanship 2.0 case study number 8, the next one in the series here. Too Hot to Handle, coming March, I can't see the last date on there. March 8th, that's what I thought it was, coming up next month. And spread the word about Airmanship 2.0, even if you don't quite understand it yet, or you think it's all a bunch of hogwash. Start talking to other guys about it, because we believe that we have to get most of us who are personal flyers here flying under Airmanship 2.0 if we're going to save the privilege of personal flying in the United States. And again, a lot more can be said about that. And look for the new Airmanship Challenge program that was just launched in December by the Center for Airmanship Excellence. And again, you can find out a lot more about that at airmanshipexcellence.org at the website. One final poll question. I misled you. I'm sorry, but this is, believe me, the last poll question. So let me just ask you this. How likely are you to look more deeply into Airmanship 2.0? Couple more votes, looks like. All right, I think we have everybody. Close it and share the results with you. 50%, very likely. 29%, somewhat likely. 18%, likely. So that's about 80% that are fill us category, and 3% not at all. So I'm sorry, it's almost 98%. It's 97 to be exact. I'll get the math right. I think I'm getting into task overload here, or fatigue, one or the other. Appreciate that. That gives us a lot of good feedback on how effective these programs are. So thank you for hanging in here to the bitter end and for providing me with that feedback. I want to thank you for your participation. I know we went long. I usually hold these things down to about an hour. We went about an hour and over hour and 50 here this evening. But I enjoyed it. I hope you did too. I learn something every time I go through one of these accidents case studies, and I hope you learned something here tonight. If you have come up with questions or comments that didn't quite come to mind tonight while we were in session, please feel free to give me a call at this number or email me at this email address. And if you just want to go to the website and hit the contact button, you can also get to me that way. So I'll leave you with this final word. Fly safely.